You're listening to Data Center Therapy. Please take a number, and an engineer will be right with you. Welcome back, everyone, to yet another episode of Data Center Therapy, a podcast from Ivoxy Consulting that talks all things IT with a healthy dose of empathy. I'm your host, Matt. Game of Thrones Season 8 needed a DR plan, Yeti. And alongside me is my co-host, Matt Casalino.
Season 8 didn't exist, did it?
In each episode, we dive into the wide range of technologies that make up this beautiful sandbox called IT that we all play in. We share our hopes and dreams, opinions both positive and critical alike, all with a touch of empathy, because at the end of the day, we all need a seat on that couch. All right, so just to let everybody know, our hands-on vSphere 6.7 advanced class is coming September 22nd through the 24th. It's fully virtual, and it's led by our consultant, Shane Bradley, who's been a VMware expert since 2001 and has been actively consulting on it for over a decade. We have a special code just for you Data Center Therapy listeners. DCT1000 saves you $1,000. This is no 1 month for free. This is no $7 savings over an online magazine. That's a cool G. DCT1000. So check out the show notes to learn more. Okay, today, our topic, we're talking about challenges in DR. So hence the Game of Thrones DR, as in, step 1 is define a disaster. Well, one could say, fire, earthquake, and Game of Thrones Season 8. Anyway, we have a special guest here to chat with you about this topic. Excited to welcome on the show for the first time, Ivoxy consultant Neil Kassal. Neil, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Matt?
Neil.
Yeah, right. It's good to have a new face, new to the podcast face, right? First time, episode 41. But you just celebrated your 2-year anniversary not too long ago at Ivoxy, right, Neil?
I did.
All right. So how did you get to this point?
Well, I think I've learned a bunch about VMware and storage, and I'm helping out customers, and I'm loving every day of it.
Yeah. What have you done prior to coming to Ivoxy?
Well, I was on the customer side for many, many years. I worked for PayPal and Wyndham
That's a big
Hotels. Yeah. And
so do I have you to blame for the 2.9%?
I wasn't on that business side.
I can't pin that on you, no?
That's right. Keeping the lights on. And I also worked for America West Airlines, which later became U.S. Airways, and now most folk know it as American Airlines.
So how has the shift went from, and most of us have gone through this, the operations to consulting.
Mm-hmm.
I think it really behooves Ivoxy to have engineers that aren't career sales engineers, even though that we're technically a type of sales engineer, but we're very, I think, unique where we are consultants in that we've lived and bled the operations world, and a lot of us still have that passion,
pager.
right, for doing it ourselves, our home labs, etc.
Yeah.
I think that gives us a unique tone in terms of, listen, Mr. Customer, I want to work with you to make your life better because I still live that myself, and I know what that feels like.
Absolutely. I started off, doing storage and Linux, a lot of open systems work, and it was only later in my career that I learned, what a lot of people probably consider table stakes, like Windows and VMware.
I didn't realize you were such a Linux guy, such the Linux guy that you were.
Yeah. I remixed back in '99. I made a remix of Red Hat 6.2, not advanced. Red Hat 6. This is 6.2 when there was no paid for product, and remixed it into something called Colossus for when I worked for Blackboard, and learned how to compile things.
Blackboard,
you don't still have a copy of that floating around in the old 3.5s, do you?
I might have an ISO of it somewhere. I might need to go through the old records there. Yeah,
Blackboard, the school
it's fun.
software.
What's that?
Blackboard, the school software.
That's right. I did work for the ASP division, so the schools that couldn't afford or didn't have their own administrators, we ran a little business inside the business where we would maintain their MySQL databases or Oracle databases, depending on how big a setup they had, and we ran their web servers and their middleware. And
it was an exciting time to play around with Linux and be on that train.
Mm-hmm.
I remember my English teacher in high school was a bit of a nerd. So being an English teacher, there was writing and stuff like that part of it. And he had a semicircle around the outside of his room of I couldn't tell you the exact model, but they were the black and white screen, maybe 9-inch Mac, all in one, like Macintosh
Oh, the
2, or
little cube ones that were those ones?
they were. No, go back farther.
Oh.
Go back farther. This is like System 7 days, like you know, the built-in little monitor box. They were the yellow tint plastic
Mhm.
with the slot for the floppy in the front. So that he had a bunch of those, and so lo and behold, he liked tech, really, to say that. And so people would do papers, and I did a paper when I was, oh, I don't know, 14 years old, 15 years old, on Linux, and he was just, I mean, it was total nerd bonus points. He loved it. This was like 97, and it was crazy. Yeah, but Red Hat 6.2, bringing it back. Good call. Well, we're not here to talk about Linux. I mean, we can. It's fun, but today we do want to talk about DR and the challenges of it, and that it's one of those things that can be a tough discussion to have because it's it's like an insurance
Yeah,
policy,
it's an
and
insurance question.
in yeah, almost all of our family members, until they lose that first hard drive, they had not been backing up, and boy, do they wish they had. I'll never make that mistake again. You hear
Mm-hmm.
that? DR is a thing, same kind of thing going on. So, Neil, how do you frame that out when it comes to disaster? What are my foundations that I step on and go forward? What are the first things I have to think about?
Well, first off, you need to discover what is truly, your top tier apps and data for your business. If you had downtime on this set of servers or this application, what would it cost your business? That's the kind of the first step, is to kind of classify what the cost of downtime is, and then kind of roll backwards from there.
So that's kind of where you get that RPO RTO question, right? And what do you end up talking to customers about to get that? How's that conversation go?
So you have to kind of be a little cross disciplinary. It's not just about talking to IT folks. You have to kind of approach folk that interface with businesses, and kind of discover what is acceptable in terms of, if you had lost transactions, what's acceptable in terms of the time it might take to restore your your business operations if there was some kind of a problem with the active site. So that's kind of the first thing you do, is kind of engage with those business folk, talk about the recovery point objectives, how much data loss is acceptable, and those
Well,
recovery time objectives.
I find it it's a funny thing to ask, but depending, like you said, you bring different parties in, not necessarily just the tech folk, right? Because they're not always the ones, and typically the ones driving the how long do I have to keep things for, and what do I have to keep, and that's all usually policy driven.
Mm-hmm.
But one of my most fun questions with DR is, what do you consider disaster? That is a lot of things to a lot of people, and it can be meteor strike, it can be earthquake. A lot of people think earthquake. Around our area, we look at Rainier as a potential disaster source. But corruption, malware, all of that is a disaster as well. It doesn't need to be some natural
Kind
disaster.
of like, what does it take to push that button and say, hey, you know what, we're gonna pull the trigger and do this now.
Right,
Absolutely.
and which one of those is likely or realistic or possible enough to make it worth spending the resources and the planning on hedging against it, and which are just like, you know what? If a meteor hits downtown Seattle, there's probably not a whole lot I need to worry about. There's that, or the company, depending on the geo reach too. So
Mm-hmm.
that's always one of my most fun things to suss out. Is no, and I think it takes some people by surprise, because I think there's an assumption built into that, which you're bringing us in to be objective and think outside the bounds of the normal business process. Let's take all the assumptions and throw them away. Let's go to brass tacks. And I like breaking it down like that.
Yeah, I think guarding against, the human elements, malware, or, sabotage, ransomware, things like that are kind of the lowest hanging fruit, and the most likely things. Obviously, cyber terrorism, at plane, hitting your data center, less likely, but still, with the right strategies in place, with the right, infrastructure deployed, a lot of times just addressing the more likely things will also cover you for those corner cases too.
So what? what's your preferred, like if you had to build a policy, if you had to build something and you had all the people you could talk to, you could build RPOs, RTOs, define all of that data, how would you want to what would you want to build for a DR plan? How would you want that to look?
Well, generally you're going to make a master catalog of applications, and you're going to build a document that says, um, ideally you're going to have granularity to fail these applications between sites, so you can kind of remove, kind of infrastructure maintenance being, potential, business impacting things. So if you can fail over some of your applications to other sites, great. So that master catalog and working off of a plan that allows granular recoverability is optimal. Not every business can kind of conform to that. So sometimes you just have a plan that, hey, if we lose this data center, we're just going to fail over with this replicated data on our storage over to this other one. And here's our SRM plan or Zerto plan, and that's a viable strategy as well. Obviously, less flexible, but
Matt,
that,
Matt,
yeah,
can I pick on you
Sure.
about a piece of that? If you are doing a DR, do you prefer to keep IPs the same or change them?
Um,
I know my answer from a system side. I want to know what Neil's answer is from a system side and network and Kazo from a network side because
well, nowadays because I have a tool that can support it, I'd keep it all the same.
there
I
you
think
go.
that
There you
I
go.
think that bolts together with the question of um, is a DR plan actually a plan if you haven't tested it, right? So
Well, yeah, and I've even at home, and this might be an indictment on my own environment management skills, but I get DNS cache poisoning all the time on my Mac. I don't know what it is. I have a bunch of VPNs going, this and that. I have a public facing domain and internal, but I use a ad blocker like AdGuard as a DNS server, and yet still I'll ping my local domain sometimes, and it gives me my WAN IP instead of my local subnet. And so to that point, the idea of DHCP everything, it doesn't matter because I'll just get a host name and refer to that, scares me. And I know a lot of people, when they talk about elastic resources using the cloud, just throw it in DHCP and let DNS handle it. Well, then how many of you out there can assume that your apps are all written nice without some static connection string somewhere in there in a web app file or it's just it doesn't exist. And the idea of changing IPs terrifies me. So
hmm
you're talking something like an NSXT segment where you can just that's over there now and let your routes basically shift around should you want to move your environment from one side to the other.
hmm that's
yeah,
yeah,
That's
that's exactly what I'd lean towards. So that gives you the network portability, right?
welcome on board, Matt.
well, and
Erling's delicious.
NSXT, and that network portability are really, really nice for not just the DR purposes, but we actually just helped out a customer the other day with a data center migration from Oregon to Texas, and because they don't use NSXT quite yet, we had to kind of make a very
It's a
thorough
lot of
plan.
work.
Yeah, exactly. We had to work with their network team and make sure the routes, were shifted over at this particular point in the migration, and then other VMs lose connectivity on the source
hmm
side, and so we had to, of course, hurriedly get those VMs running on the target side. So it definitely makes things a lot easier if you don't have to re-IP, and if you have
So you weren't
automated routing.
stretching then, Neil. They
No,
weren't stretching.
it was basically egress out of the one side or egress out of the other side,
And
and
unless you have the infrastructure in place to support having them both up and running, that's kind of how you have to do it. Is
yeah,
like it's going to stop here now, and then we're going to run it down there, right?
that's right.
So Matt, talking with Mac. So we got Matt. We got three Matts at Ivoxia. We have a Mac.
hmm
So that's not confusing at all.
Not
But
not what's not at all.
talking with Mac, he's not only our director of consulting, but he's also a networking savant. Anybody who's spoken with him would probably agree there. But I talk with him, and sometimes I still get the old school look on his face when I talk about stretching a layer two network across a WAN link, because I still think things like 1 gig or faster WAN links are, while they're more common than they ever have been, it's still, I think, to a pure network guy is kind of like, ooh, you don't want to be pushing that broadcast traffic across that quote unquote WAN link, right? Is that so much of a problem anymore, or should everybody just layer two stretch? Should you have the infrastructure available?
Are you asking me that question because I got the network hat on?
I don't know. I guess I don't know. I'm hitting the wall. If anybody wants to pick that up.
Neil, you got any thoughts? Because I got a whole box full of stuff.
Oh, I imagine so. I mean, in the context of DR, obviously, yeah, if you're stretching, it could make things easier. In this, going back to that migration, with that customer, their new data center in Texas actually has another data center literally right across the street, and so, that customer is leveraging Pure's active cluster technology, and they're stretching their layer two for iSCSI connectivity between all the hosts and storage arrays.
Now that's cool.
Yeah, and it's a really neat setup. Obviously, it would also make DR between those two data centers, easier as well. So it's a neat use case. That's
So
that's all my thoughts.
I think that right there answers your question, Yeti. If you have, it depends on your traffic, right? So if you've got two data centers, and that's really important for the traffic between those two data centers to be available and fast and high bandwidth, then you need to have a dedicated lease line, or you need to have dark fiber between those two sites. If you're connecting your head offices, main data centers to all of your branches, then use VPN over the internet, use SD-WAN, because you're talking about what's the impact of loss of
Sure,
connectivity.
I'm speaking strictly on a what's my core what networks do I want to survive a disaster?
Mm-hmm.
And the networks that my servers live on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I want those IPs not to change. And um, I find if I have a warm DR site, a warm or a hot DR site, I would love a stretch layer two out of that to wherever that DR site is.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's my thought there. In that makes things. I mean, you can test super easily. Just
You can
things.
you can put that's kind of where I lean towards now that we can is you can put an entire data center into air quotes maintenance mode,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So
And I guess what Mac will tell me is, well, now you've got a layer three. You got to remember to swing your interface over to the surviving site. Okay, DR is not some automatic AI thing that just works. I mean, there's going to be some input, and you never want. I don't think DR you won't want to automatically trigger because false positives are. Oops. So if I have to go type a route statement in on this router and follow this little doc and Joey, remote hands, I think that's totally fine. A good fail safe too to swinging all of your route tables over to a DR site. You may want to make sure you really really want to do that.
yeah, yeah, I agree.
So Neil, what are the obviously things have changed. You mentioned Zerto and SRM. Um, what are you seeing out there in terms of working with the customers that things have changed, right? Is SRM still? I mean, there was a lot of it out there. Is that still a thing? Is it kind of a rubric that I mean, what are you seeing out there in the field?
So I have seen, the adoption of a lot of technologies like Rubrik, where folk can kind of store a tertiary copy, out in their S3 buckets or Blobland on the Azure side. So that's probably been the biggest, change I've seen is folks kind of considering cloud as at least a storage. Um, dumping ground for a tertiary copy, or even potentially leveraging it as in the event of a DR scenario, some place to turn up their VMs. Um, SRM's getting sunset, kind of, that the word on the street. So the product's, gotten mature. It's not really getting added to. So a lot of folk have kind of looked into Zerto, potentially replacing VMware's SRM. VMware themselves don't seem to be um, kind of wanting a piece of that pie at the moment, but of course things could change, and that's kind of the new things I've seen working with it.
That's always confused me. It always seems like VMware, gorilla in the room, the underpinning of almost everything we do, and yet it seems like the opportunities they've slipped through a little bit. Where if VMware pushed their vCloud Air, remember that?
Yeah.
If they pushed harder, we could be talking about AWS, Azure, and vCloud Air. I mean, imagine being able to vMotion your VMs over the It's there now. You don't have now that lives on as VMware on AWS and VMware on Azure, but it took a long time to get there. And then SRM, it was somewhat of a de facto standard. I don't know, being we're talking about DR, it's not like everybody has a DR plan, and so therefore it's not as ubiquitous as something like vSphere. But you said the sunsetting. It doesn't sound like there's a plan to replace that with the new and great beta version of whatever they're coming out with.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. I haven't seen much from VMware. So either they're quiet and working on something amazing, or they just they're going to concentrate their efforts elsewhere.
I get the impression that they're they're all in on the software defined data center as a whole.
I
They
think you're
want
right.
you to don't worry about moving this using SRM. Don't worry about using this tool to pick it up and move it. Define your storage attached to your hosts. Use your software defined networking. Then it
NSX,
doesn't
yes.
matter because you can just shuffle it over there. You can shuffle it over there. It's all software built. I,
Yep.
I I feel like that's where they're going with it, and that's what they're doubling down on.
Not really like too bad write your own tool, but too bad write your own tool because we're giving you the underpinnings to do whatever you want. And they have these, vRealize orchestrator automation. Probably instead of narrowly building one product that lives on Automator or vRealize automation anyway, they're
Mm-hmm.
just saying here's the tools. Go ahead and do whatever you want. I guess that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny to me in the automation point of view where we live so much in that bootstrap environment where we've got to install this new array, build this new set of ESX hosts, get all this stuff up and running so that you can start to do all the automation stuff on top of it. And a lot of times that's kind of where we've built this environment and handed it off. And I want to automate that initial build. That's kind of a goal I have.
Yeah, I mean, you got to have hands on at some point, though. At some point, you're plugging the keyboard and mouse in.
I mean, we can do what is it? Boot from Pixie Boot.
Ooh,
We can Pixie Boot those ESX
Pixie,
servers.
you can. That's the key right there. Once you're on the network, you're on the
Right?
network.
But then you
It's
gotta have the
Pixie,
network in place. But then you gotta right. It's this old chicken and the egg thing before you can.
right? Can't get an NSX environment up on nothing. Huh? Yeah. Well,
So
so Neil, are you seeing? Let's go into it, man. Cloud versus colo. Uh, you know, secondary data center. What are you seeing out there as far as trends go?
So I think right now, most of the customers I've personally interacted with view the cloud as not the main, DR site, but rather, um, they're kind of looking at the cloud as an emergency or tertiary setup. So they're integrating it with their secondary storage, things like Rubrik and maybe they copy vmextents over to the cloud. But for the most part, those customers that have second sites are happy to have them in their infrastructure. They replicate NetApp to NetApp or Pure to Pure, and they have tools to kind of help orchestrate that, or at least well-defined procedures to flip things back and forth.
That secondary data center, to me, I think cloud is a lot more attractive to users who don't already have a secondary data center. Um, but I think sometimes they look at that contract and they say, "Boy, we're spending a lot in that data center." I try to talk to them and say, "Let's look at it. You're probably not really paying that much for that data center. It's been an expense for a long time. You haven't had to use it, so it turns into like, why am I paying all this insurance when I've never went to the doctor?" But chances are you're not going to save money going to the cloud. I mean, maybe DR is one of the more compelling, I think, uh, um, use application cases for the cloud from a standpoint of on demand. That sounds nice. So you pay a little bit every month, but if you need to turn it on, you'll pay full fare. But so what? You need it. Um, but then again, the amount of work to get there and to
mm-hmm.
maintain that is, I think that curve is a bit steeper. Where a lot of
Yeah.
times with the secondary data center, my infrastructure's there. I don't even necessarily need to buy new kit. I hand me down my old stuff. Maybe I don't renew the support contracts on this, and just it's there. I've already bought the hardware. I don't need to buy it twice. So there's that too.
Yep, absolutely.
There's absolutely non-substantial dollar amount, time amount, personal time, personal energy to building that cloud infrastructure to be able to support turning those VMs on, right?
Yep.
I think a
The
lot of
cloud
times that
thing,
goes by the
we
wayside.
all have our little buckets in the cloud where we do testing and learning and development. I'm guilty, and I hope nobody from my Voxy's listening. I've had a VM that I left on 1 month. Oops, sorry for that. $70, or no, I mean probably more than that, but it was an unexpected cost, and it was just easy just to sit here do and not realize it for a month.
Yep.
Um, and I know a lot of the tools that are being developed now are around that monitoring and alerting on that. But I mean, Microsoft, Amazon's happy to go ahead. What's their incentive to
Sure,
say,
turn
hey,
it on,
are you
leave it
sure
running.
this is still something you want?
Oh yeah.
Do you still want to keep giving us money? Are you positive? Not really, on their
You know
coming
what? You
soon
should
release notes.
probably leave this running a little longer, just in case.
No, that domain controller, you want 16 core. You want the big V3 DS2 or whatever on there. Yeah, we were. I was on another opportunity with a customer where we were scoping out um, the new firepower, the Cisco ASA replacement, and they have the orchestrator, kind of like I would assume Caso the panorama the panorama equivalent for Palo Alto, and it is the collector and the configurator and the analyzer for firepower, and they they offer an on-premise appliance, right? A virtual appliance. They don't support Hyper-V. They support VMware and KVM, but not Hyper-V, which is just interesting to me.
Bizarre.
So they also offer the OVA for Azure, though. They do support Azure. I mean, we know Azure's not Hyper-V, but I thought it might have been a Microsoft political thing. Well, if that's the case, why do they support Azure? Anyway, the instance that they the instance that they require in Azure works out without storage to like $750 a month for this VM.
Of course it is. You know,
And I mean that's something that if you've got the spare capacity on your servers in your data center, that's just another VM.
Yep.
And it runs. So, ouch.
Yeah.
that's one of those things, though. You see that like all the time. We deploy these manager VMs. We deploy NSX managers, VRAs, VROs, whatever. Suddenly you're into just management compute storage memory for a terabyte of memory for just management stuff to
Yep.
get your environment running. It's
I can't lab out
insane.
NSXT at home. I can't. And not only that, but my little 3-node NUC cluster is running vSAN, so there was a third of my RAM for that too.
Right?
Poof.
Oh boy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
RAM's the expensive one too.
It is.
Oh,
So
yeah.
do you see
It's always been.
any specific applications that lend themselves better to being highly available? Like what's your litmus test for, do I need to handle this as a special unique app, or hey, we can natively do it inside of a VM or inside of an application?
Well, there's a lot of applications that are designed to kind of use their own availability systems, SAP, SQL Server, Oracle database, um, some distributed open source databases as well. And generally, when you can leverage those, you can potentially make things a little more efficient. You can make things a little faster for failover events. But um, I like the fact that in this world, a lot of infrastructures you're really close to 100% virtualized, if not 100% virtualized, and having leveraging an orchestration tool like an SRM or a Zerto allows you to have very easy um, flip over. You can run tests, with the click of a button. You can fail over your sites at the click of a button. So, in as much as you can kind of stick to one technology, at least one orchestration tool, that makes things, I think, nicer to run if you're an admin, if you're on the IT side of things.
Yeah, cool. I'm glad we've got the same thoughts there. Exchange is the one I always bring up. But
Oh, yeah.
Hey, if you can, run
It's
both of them.
that's
Run two of
yeah.
them.
Wait, why has my DAG been running out of my secondary site for the
Who
last 3
cares?
weeks?
It's active,
But that
active,
is
right?
that is kind of it is kind of it's not a bad thing. But when you think about DR, you almost want it to be a switch.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And when you've got some applications that just do it better natively, SQL always on, things like that, you almost can't get to that utopia where it's just like either I'm here or I'm there. You've got this set of VMs is handled by my rubric script or whatever. This set of VMs is handled by this, and then I've got my native applications that handle that all by themselves. Um, that's the tough part because there really isn't a super clean DR plan in most environments. I would say there's always probably a few different ways of getting everything back up.
Yep.
But then again, in Kazo, if we haven't said our favorite word, containers. And again, uh, I still think we're getting to the point where containers are a great use case for stateful data, right? Everything was
State,
stateless with containers,
but
and I think,
even those have the same issue. That's stateful data, right?
yep,
Has
where
has
is it?
has to move from site to site. So if you've got something
Yep,
like Neil, your customer that's got the Pure and the iSCSI active cluster, that's great because now it lives both places.
data's
But unless
everywhere.
you've got something like that,
Yep.
what are you going to do? That's no different than a regular VM.
Totally.
Well, do we see that object store getting to the point now where it'll get performance to the point where it's going to be in multiple locations, and then the balancer itself or the object store itself is basically, you're all talking to multi endpoints, and it's just geo and all of that. I mean, that's where your data is. It's over there.
Yeah.
And you could have transient performance issues depending on the state of the network at that point, but now that's cloudy.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're almost there. We're not quite there yet.
And then every now and then we run into a manufacturer or construction or something old school that still turns wrenches and cuts steel and stuff like that, and they buy this app and here's this one box that sits over here and does this thing. I'm like, dude, guys, this is 2020 now.
Neil did say he has AIX experience.
I do. There's still a few shops that have it out there.
Yep.
AS400 also.
AS400.
Oh yeah.
They won't go down. They just keep running.
Yep.
Distributed clusters.
Well, Neil, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fun one. It's fun to finally get you on. Took us 41 episodes, but we finally broke into your schedule. Thank you for allowing it.
Right on. Thank you.
Don't forget about our hands-on vSphere 6.7 advanced class. So September 22nd to the 24th. So you're a month out or less than now by the time you're listening to this. So make sure to use the link in the show notes to learn more. Don't forget to use the code DCT1000 to save a cool G. Yeah. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Google, though not Google Play. Sorry, Kaz, I'm not going to let this go. Whatever Google's latest beta version of a podcast store is. Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify, we're on all of that. Anywhere that fine podcasts are shared, you can subscribe to us. Leave us reviews. We'd really like a 5-star review. Kazo was just complaining to me over the weekend on that. As he was out camping and driving, it was really on his mind.
Exactly. That was on my mind.
Yes. Find us at ivoxy.com or datacentertherapy.com and email us at podcast@ivoxy.com. And thank you for the spam bots who have apparently scraped this episode to find that email as well. Yes. For Mr. Kassal and Mr. Kozlino, I am Matt Yeti. Thank you very much for listening to Data Center Therapy, y'all. Have a good one.